Good evening, everyone. So I want to welcome you to tonight's talk on values and engagements with Islam and classical Sufi thinkers here at Trinity Hall. Thank you for coming to sign up for this event. The first thing I want to start off with is I want to thank the Cambridge Interfaith Forum. Without their kind of support, their practical support, this event would not have been possible. But also the Cambridge Interfaith Programme provides a kind of theological framework to have these interfaith discussions that so often don't take place within the city. And if Iona, who's here, will also be talking about their work a little later on. And then after that, a lot of you might not know when you first saw the invitation, but this room actually has quite a lot of historical importance. So it's called the Bridge Tower Room, and it's named after George Bridge Tower. There's a portrait of him there, if you want to have a look. Or at least I'm assuming that's him. And so George Bridge Tower was the first Black student that's ever admitted to Trinity Hall, who's also a musician, and I'm sure Satnam Singh will attest to that both Sikhi and Sufi Islam have kind of a deep musical tradition behind them, and often music is used as kind of vehicle to express love for the divine and also spirituality. And then I'm going to go through kind of the program of how we're going to do the talk today. So after I finish speaking, we will also have Dr. Iona. She will be speaking next on the work of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme. After that, Satnam Singh will be giving a keynote lecture, followed by a question and answer session. So you can ask many questions that you have then, and I'm sure he'll give you some very insightful answers. And then after that, we have some closing remarks from Dr. Angad Barua, who's also here from the Faculty of Divinity. And then the last thing is, if any of you are in here at Cambridge for longer than just today, we do also have a conference going on tomorrow, and Dr. Angad Barua is a lead in that. It's called Guru, Imam and Thar. Right. And it also kind of feeds into this kind of lecture, and Satnam Singh will again be presenting tomorrow as part of the wider panel of academics. So I think I haven't forgotten everything. So I will pass over to Iona now, who will have a few words on the Cambridge Programme. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I'm Dr. Iona. I'm Programme Manager of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, which has been around for coming up on 25 years based on the Faculty of Divinity. We are a research centre that does a lot more than an average research centre, so we're very engaged, and we deliberately look to work beyond the walls of the university. And also, one of the things that we've been doing, myself with our current director, Professor Esheret, is to acknowledge that knowledge about religion, interest in religion, really deep, rich engagement is not confined to the Faculty of Divinity. So we have a research forum which is open to scholars at the University of Cambridge who are interested in taking religion seriously, wherever you might be domiciled in a disciplinary way, college way, you can connect with us and find people to collaborate with, find people who are interested. And so it's really great to be collaborating today on this event with the Cambridge University Sikh Society. I hope it's the first of many collaborations to come. What else do we do? Dr. Barua's symposium tomorrow has already been mentioned. We try to look out for and support various different things. I am personally in the middle of a sandwich because I've spent my day with Muslims who travelled from around Britain to be in Cambridge today to think about how practically you cite the moon and about working towards a common calendar for Muslims in Britain. So it would be very clear that everybody can fast during Ramadan together, everyone can celebrate Eid together. And I have to head off to Cambridge Central Mosque because they're having hospitality there this evening, and fingers crossed, attempting to see an extremely young new festival this evening. If you the sun is shining outside at the moment, maybe they will succeed. But so we do all kinds of things. That's why I mentioned that next week we have a trio of different education-related events that we're supporting. A symposium organised by a colleague who also trains religious education teachers, exploring how being immersed in the ways in which individual particular religious traditions offer religious education might provide actually an inclusive experience. So that's Tuesday of next week. Also from the Centre of Islamic Studies, organising CPD for education teachers. And we also have, for the 4th year running now, a student-led symposium that's inclusive for undergraduates as well as postgraduates. This year themed around religious freedom, and that is open to anyone, and it's free to attend next Wednesday. So that's kind of a loose flavour of the kinds of things that we're up to. It's a really great pleasure. You know, I am always conscious that the University of Cambridge has been around a bit more than 800 years, and in many ways it is normatively Christian. And it's a really slow process unlearning that kind of normativity. That's something you might experience sometimes if you come to the Faculty of Divinity, because many of the courses that you could study are in some ways connected to Christianity, and sometimes that's more quiet than others. So it's, you know, our programme was established particularly around Abrahamic faith, so around Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And I myself, after doing a degree in divinity, in theology at the faculty, went on to study Jewish Christian relations, and that was quite radical at the time because it was a new centre for Jewish Christian relations at Cambridge. It was less than 5 years old when I was there, and I hopefully you can tell I'm not that old. So what I'm getting at is that this is a university that is still learning how to be more curious and stretch its curiosity globally. I get great pleasure from working with Dr. Brewer, who really embodies curiosity across religions and that doesn't try to think about division, but is much more interested. So I feel like today's talk is very much significant in terms of attending to that kind of stuff, and I hope there will be more and more diversification and curiosity and moving beyond historic norms. So thank you for collaborating with us. It's a great pleasure to be able to sponsor tonight's event, and I apologise that I can't say the entirety of the talk. However, it's being recorded, and therefore I will be catching up later.
Hope they can see me. Is it good? Should be okay, yeah. Should be great. And hopefully the sound is good as well. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation as well, for setting this program up. You hear the sound? So, yes, I'm very excited because I get to share some of my preliminary findings and your early Sikh engagements with Islamic classical Sufi thinkers with you guys. I'll shortly present the concept. But for those of you that don't know me, my research is both early Sikh engagements with Islamic and Indic philosophy, and illumines, sounds like a bit of a, what do you call it, like a another sermon. Yeah, so my research explores early Sikh engagements with Islamic and Indic philosophy, and the luminous transmission of knowledge across communities and religious boundaries, whatever that meant back in the day. Also looking at translation and intellectual engagement through the lens of interpretation and selection. So for instance, what I'm looking at is not how South Asian Islam looked like in Punjab in the 1700s. What I'm looking at is how did Sikhs understand Islam in the 1700s? What did they take as inspiration, and what did they discard, so to speak? And that is like what I mean when I say interpretation and selection. And also perhaps the other way around, like what did Muslims think about Sikhs and what did they emphasize on the Sikh tradition back in the 1700s? I'm also looking at continuity despite rupture, so like political violence, destruction of central courts and patronage. How does the intellectual tradition of the Sikhs continue despite everything else that is kind of going on in society? And then also like everyday intellectual life beyond the elite institutions. So when you talk, I'll talk more about it, but when you talk about intellectual history, it's usually elite institutions that you're looking at. You're looking at a court where knowledge and literature and so forth is being produced. But I'm looking at like in the villages and the towns, at a social life, networks and so forth. How is literature produced? How is how is knowledge passed on to new younger generations and so forth? It's a bit more tricky because most of the stuff that we do know about is from the courts, from the darbars, for those of you who know that word. But I like a good challenge. So that's why I kind of dug into it. And overall, what I do is that I look at the Sikh traditions and the Sikh scholars in the 1700s as active participants in trans-regional questions of truth, philosophy, ethics, mysticism, political science, and so forth. Now, what does that mean? Basically, there is this understanding today that Sikh scholars in the 16 and 1700s, they were primarily just engaged with Sikh history. They were engaged with Guru history and covering what is Sikhism teaching, so to speak. So it's very like inward oriented, it's very insular, to some extent even very poor understanding of what Sikh scholars back then were doing. Because what you'll see is that they're actually outward looking. They're engaging in the philosophical discussions that other communities were also engaged in at the time, looking at truth, philosophy, ethics, mysticism, like political science, and so forth. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I'm basically trying to highlight the scholarly side to the Sikh community at the time. Like I said, this is preliminary research for my upcoming book. It's going to be chapter 4 so far. So I'm still developing my ideas. Feel free to challenge me afterwards, provide me additional sources if there's something I've overlooked and so forth that might strengthen my analysis. So what I'm providing here, I'm not saying this is how things work. This is just how I perceive and interpret things according to the sources that are there. So the first book I wrote, I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I was trying to do the same thing. I went to Oxford to present my ideas in front of the audience. I got a lot of good feedback from the audience. Obviously, I took that feedback and put it into the book. So by all means, feel free to challenge me. Yes. Just a quick introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name is Satnam Singh, born and based in Denmark. I'm an author of this book here, The Road to Empire, the Political Education of Khalsa Sikhs in the late 1600s. And I'm just in general a researcher of South Asian intellectual history. I just had an article that came out a few months ago on Sikh intellectual history in the 1700s, 1600s, and this article then looks into the 1700s. You can download it for free. I'll put a link up at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. But I'm basically trying to show another image of Sikhs, apart from this whole warrior, hyper-masculine, weapon-bearing kind of image that we're often presented with. On a day-to-day basis, I work as a senior consultant for the Danish government. I've been engaged in a lot of crime prevention programs for the past, 14, 15 something-ish years, primarily political radicalization, so prevention of recruitment to groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, ISIS when they came around. And then later on, I moved on to prevention of violence against children and women. That's what I do now. So a lot of this is something I do on the side, if that makes sense. All right, so overall claims, I'll be talking for about 1 hour and 10 minutes, and it's going to be a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, something that doesn't make sense, or just feel free to just interrupt me or just raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll do a Q&A towards the end of it. Yeah. All right, so my overall claim, this chapter 4, is that to varying degrees, the Sikh gurus and the scholars in the 1700s, they exhibited mastery and engagement with the full corpus of Islamic knowledge, as we find it in the Qur'an, in the Hadith literature, that's like a compilation of the sayings of the Prophet, Islamic Prophet Muhammad, like the utterances, what did he say? Then they've written it down in corpus of literature called Hadith literature. As we find them in narratives on the early pioneers of Sufism. I'll dive into that later on in the presentation. And then also translations of major seminal Sufi classics, primarily Rumi and al-Ghazali. And these are it's like the high literature of the Sufi tradition, where Sufi ideas in the 12th, 1300s are being systematized. As well as contemporary Persian political science and Muslim social practices. So what I basically argue is that the Sikh scholars, and I'll hopefully present that during this presentation, they do exhibit varying degrees of mastery and engagement with this corpus and this body of knowledge that we find in this category, so to speak. So overall, the literature that we'll dive into exhibits both the breadth and depth of the tradition. Sikh scholars overall appear to have acknowledged, to have absorbed, to have reworked, and also challenged the philosophical ideas of the Islamic faith. Yes, I'll use this word quite a lot. Islamic faith. Have you heard that before? So basically, it's a distinction that you make in academia where you distinguish Islamic from Islamic faith. So a lot of literature was produced in Persia and the Mughal Empire that was not necessarily religiously Islamic, but it was produced by Muslims. So like a good example is the Shahnameh, if you know that. It's Persian epic. It's not Islamic literature, but it was produced in a Muslim court for a Muslim patron. It was read by Muslims. It was written for a Muslim audience. It was transmitted into Muslim institutions, but it's not an Islamic book. It's not a religious book. So what they've coined is this word called the Islamic faith. So yeah, anything that has been produced can also be art, doesn't have to be literature. And they produced a similar word which is Indic for the Sanskrit world, which is literature, artworks, whatever it might be that is produced, perhaps in Sanskrit or on the Indian South Asian continent, but it's not necessarily religious in nature. So yeah, there's a lot of literature. I'm just name dropping, like the Arthashastra. You have the Hitudesha, the Panchtantra, a lot of stuff that has been written for Hindu audience in Sanskrit, promoted in the Hindu dharamsalas, but it's not Hindu literature per se. Does that make sense? Yes, it's a very good word actually for you, those of you interested to use and employ. Because you can also like get out of discussions on whether does this literature align with Islam. It's not, that's not the purpose of it, but you can easily fall into these kind of traps. If someone, all right. Now, the issue is that despite such extensive engagements, which I'll hopefully be able to demonstrate during this presentation, works of these literatures are understudied in Western academia. I would say it's quite an extensive element of literature that was produced, but in Western academy, nobody has really looked that much into it. There's a few really, really good scholars like Louis Fenwick and others who have looked into it, but it's very, very limited. So there's a lot of work that needs to be continued. All right. This image here is very, I would say, representative of how people understand the Sikh tradition in the 1700s and the Sikh history in general in the 1700s. What you see, as you can see, is an illustration of warfare. It's martial conflict. You can see that you have the Khalsa Sikhs on the one hand, and you have the Muslim opponents on the other hand. It kind of shows that there's an animosity between the Hindus and the Muslims during this century. Also, what you see in the image is the Chote Sahibzade, which is like a very traumatic event where Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Guru, the Sikh tradition, his two youngest sons were martyred at the hands of the Mughal authorities. And what usually, this is how people like in hindsight look back, is that the execution of these two children, because they refused to convert to Islam, the execution of these two children here was actually what brought about a lot of the conflicts that came later on in the 1700s between the Muslims and Sikhs. So I would say everyone is guilty of this very simple misrepresentation of what is happening in the 1700s, Sikh and non-Sikh authors alike. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily wrong, these battles and all these political conflicts and all that, it did happen. So I'm not trying to whitewash that away, but what is more interesting or also interesting is that there's another story that is also unfolding, also happening during the 1700s, and that's a story about intellectual exchange. And this is obviously what I will dive into in this presentation here. I've divided it into 4 parts in regards to this intellectual exchange. So one is the critical commentary and dialogue that you find between Sikhi and Islam within the Guru Granth Sahib, the Holy Scripture. Then you have, so the first one is about the scriptures, and then you have the literature, where you see a poetical dialogue between leading intellectuals from each tradition. I'll try to demonstrate that with a lot of examples throughout the presentation. Then you have, so this is like scripture, then you have literature, then you have circulation of teachings and narratives about Sufi saints and Quranic or biblical scholars. Now, I find that to be very interesting that there was a strand of Sikh scholars in the early 1700s, while all these wars and the conflicts and the battles were happening. You have a strand of Sikh intellectuals who are promoting stories and narratives and teachings about the Sufi saints and Quranic and biblical prophets at the time. Again, I'll go into more details later. What you also see is that so while this is happening on what you call the social sphere, like it's happening through gatha, it's happening through oral sermons, presentations, whatever you want to call it. This is more intellectual stuff, and you see difficult translations of ancient classics such as Rumi's Masnavi and Imam Ghazali's Sadat, The Alchemy of Happiness. And these are like some of the most throughout history, the most widespread and most circulated representations of Sufi literature. And the Sikhs not only adopted these writings, they also translated them, and they also spread its teaching and the gatha of these writings in their own centers, the dharamsalas and the centers of learning. And this is actually quite significant. I'll get back into that, but it's quite significant. This, from what I've been able to gather, Sikhs are actually the first ones in world history to translate the writings of Rumi and to translate the writings of Imam Ghazali into a non-Muslim vernacular. So it is very possible that, so these were written Persian originally in the 1300s. It's very possible that translations were made into Arabic and into Ottoman Turkish. But these are like Muslim languages, these are Middle Eastern languages. But it's very unusual that you see translations into non-Muslim vernacular, written most likely for a non-Muslim audience at the same time. So I would say like this is like also interesting in terms of world history, not just like regional Sikh Punjab history. All right, let's start with the first one, and just I'll start with the first one, so that's the one up here. Critical commentary within the Guru Gobind Singh. So engagements between Sikh and Islam is very foundational to Sikh history, to Sikh teachings, and so forth. You find it within the earliest Sikh sources. So that's the verses of the Gurus and the Bhagats, the saints, whose verses are found within the Guru Gobind Singh. These were both Muslim and Hindus. So in Sikh scripture, you find these engagements. Again, I'll show it in a bit. And this, the Guru Gobind Singh is primarily a text that is primarily written in the 1400s, but you have a lot of verses from these Muslims and Hindus, poet saints, that goes back probably to the 12 and 1300s. You can also find these engagements in the early secondary literature. Again, this is scripture, and then the literature, such as what we call the narrative Janam Sakya. So that's like the life stories, the narratives, the hagiography, you can even say, about the life of Nand. And you can also find it in the commentarial works of Bhai Gurdas, who was the first one to write a commentary about Sikh teachings, and he wrote it before the 1630s. Again, we're introduced to Guru Nanak's historical meetings with different kinds of Islamic authorities, both in South Asia, but also in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, current day Iran, and Mecca also. So again, like this topic here in itself is not unusual. You can find it very easily if you just look at an English translation of the Guru Gobind Singh, or if you have access to one of the Janam Sakhis, you can find many of these encounters and engagements with Muslim leaders and authorities. The engagements that we do come across, they often take the form of commentaries to outline specific Sikh positions. So you could say that the Muslim path, the Sufi Islamic path, is kind of used as an other. In Danish, we call it spilbold. It's like you're playing a ball game with it in order to like make your own position more clear. It's like you're mirroring yourself with Islam to make the Sikh position more clear. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll give you some examples of it. but also in a more interfaith, like quote unquote, to use a modern faith, to use in a more interfaith manner to build bridges between communities. So you can find some really exquisite, beautiful poetry in the Guru Granth Sahib where it praises the divine, it praises existence, you jumping and using and employing Islamic terminology for the divine, Allah, Khuda, Rahim, and so forth, bouncing back and forth between Indic and Islamic terminology to basically show the unity of existence. Yeah, so again, you have the commentary and you have the interfaith kind of approach. Then you have other verses that carry extensive criticism of Islamic authorities of the time, of Islamic practices of the time, and institutions of the time. Kabir is one of these poet saints whose writings have been included in the Guru Granth Sahib. He uses a lot of satire to advance his criticism of organized religion and rigidity in terms of, I'll give you some examples in a bit. This is a very famous, pretty sure many of you know it and have seen it, but it's a very famous line from the Guru Granth Sahib. It says, "Do not say that the Vedas, the Bible, and the Quran are false. False are those people who do not contemplate their teachings." So, yeah, it's not like there's no this like understanding that Sikh is the right path and everything else is wrong and everybody's sending to hell at some point. Like it's not really it. There is a scope for interfaith communication, discussion, harmony, and so forth. Again, do not say that the Vedas, the Bible, and the Quran are false. People who do not contemplate their teachings, they are false. What you see is that this is just one example of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh tradition. He recenters the definition of what it means to be a Muslim in a very Sufi kind of way. You can easily find Sufi poetry that does the same kind. So again, Sufis at the time who heard these verses from Guru Nanak would be able to recollect and be able to recognize this form of subversion, you could even say, of what it means to be a Muslim. And what you'll see is that basically internalizing Islam, it's making the thing of being a Muslim into something that's much more elevated, much more internalized, much more esoteric than primarily just following a set of rules, a set of guidelines, and so forth. I'll just be quiet. You can read it for yourself. So what this is so what this is probably a criticism of what people at the time understood being a Muslim meant. We can, by reading about other sources at the time, like it was very much an external identity, much related to like external practices. You had to pray in a certain way, you had to fast at a certain time of the year, you had to certain foods you were not allowed to eat. Like it's very much based on rules and regulations and so forth. And then Guru Nanak basically recenters that and says there's something more elevated, there's something else to being a Muslim. So again, like approaching the religion as sweet, like there's word used in Mikha. So again, it's like it's extracting the essence of the religion. Don't have a harsh take on your religion. Don't be cruel, like you see here. Be merciful to all beings. So that's one. It's like you also find a lot of Sufis saying that like, being a Muslim should be easy. It shouldn't be a difficult path. It should be easy for you. Yeah, something about pride. So it's about ego. It's about being devoted. It's about putting aside the delusion of death and life. I'll return to some of these topics later on. It's about submitting to God's will, getting rid of selfishness and conceit, and again being merciful to all beings. So again, it's basically showing that there's more to being a Muslim than just following a set of rules and regulations. Does that make sense? All right, let's just firstly talk about Sufism, because I'll obviously be referring to that later on, and then we'll back to some verses from the Granth Sahib so that can make more sense. Sufism today is a bit different from how it was historically. So today, if you ask any random person what you understand with Sufism, they will probably relate something related to the beautiful aesthetics that we see in the form of devotional music, and the ecstatic love poetry. So I think Rumi, the Persian poet, he was one of the most best-selling authors in America for many years in a row, I think. His poetry from the Divan Kabir, like exquisite, very popular in English translation, and that is what people associate with Sufism. And then obviously the devotional music, especially with Nusrat, like Qawwali with Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, that has a very broad non-Muslim audience. Now with social media as well, you see there's a lot of it's reaching new audiences and target groups all the time. It's being really maximized these years. So that is like in people's mind. That is what they associate with Sufism. Beautiful aesthetics in the form of devotional music and ecstatic love poetry. However, these phenomena, they reflect later stages of Sufism. So the Prophet Muhammad he dies in the year 1632. When I say later stages of Sufism, I'm talking about developments that are happening in the 900s maybe, or the 1000s. So you might say that's still very long time ago, but from Islamic perspective, that's like later stages. And that time period from the death of the Prophet Muhammad to the time that Imam Ghazali and Rumi and all these authors are born, that time period is actually longer, or that gap is actually longer than the Guru Gobind Singh's death, till today. That's 300 years, roughly. And so that's what I mean. Like it's a reflection of a later development, which has now taken center stage. This is how we understand Sufism today. But for the first few hundred years, that's not what they understood as Sufism. The early origins of Sufism, they're quite disputed amongst historians, but they kind of generally tend to agree that Sufism grew out of Middle Eastern ascetic practices as they were performed by ascetics in the Middle East, whether they were Zoroastrian, they were following the religion of money, they were Christians, maybe Jews, even like there was a lot of traditions that were very prevalent in the Middle East, the areas that later became part of the Islamic Caliphate. And scholars, like I said, they generally tend to agree that Sufism kind of grew out of these milieux, these networks and these groups, so to speak. So these early ascetics, who then become the immediate forebears to the people we later identify as Sufis, they underwent extensive austerities, devoted extraordinary time to Quranic recitation and prayer, and they generally cultivated a solemn and serious attitude towards life. I'll get back to that very soon. This last thing here. So, as a practice-oriented tradition of ascetics, their practice evolved around renunciation, sleep and food deprivation, occasional withdrawal from society, celibacy, cultivation of good deeds devoid of ego, and the cultivation of sadness and fear over past sins and resulting punishment. Now, this back then, these ascetics that later became known as Sufis, they would be their practices were very different from what the ordinary Muslims were doing. So they're very different from the mainstream bunch, or like the mainstream crowd at the time. Try to notice here that I haven't mentioned anything about love. Because love appears later on with some of the later Sufi saints, especially the female saints that we'll get back to. As the tradition evolves, so this is like this is 600s, 700s, 800s, 900s, and the thousands. As the tradition evolved, emerged, Sufism came to be known as tradition, because obviously these people, these loose networks, they come to merge with each other, and they end up having more rigid structures, and you start having these networks of students and disciples and teachers and masters. So it becomes more and more, also because they get more funding from the government and so on, they become more and more organized, basically. And over time, Sufism becomes a tradition about experiential knowledge about Allah's unity through remembrance and meditation and so forth. It's about training and domestication of the lower self, and that's through methods such as constant remembrance or recollection, of Allah, and then reorientation of life away from the lower concerns of this world towards the glory of the afterlife. So this is like kind of what in the 10th, 1100s, this is what Sufism is kind of known for at the time, as well as obviously continuing all of these different practices in order to get closer to God. Again, notice this, it's not about love yet around this time. Again, sleep and food deprivation, occasional withdrawal from society, celibacy, cultivation of good deeds, devoid of evil. So these ascetics and later Sufis, they kind of believe, you kind of do these kind of things, food deprivation, sleep deprivation, we will ensure a state of being that will make us more accessible to the divine, basically. Yes. All right. Does that make sense? Notice I said that the early Sufis were known to have a very solemn and very serious attitude toward life. You could even, without insulting anyone, you can say maybe a little bit bordering like depressive, very negative even outlook on life. If you read some of the early poetry, it's very like distancing themselves from the ways of the world and so forth. And this is something I will get back to. This is something where Sikhism really tries to position itself against this kind of ascetic and solemn attitude to life. Like I said, Sufi ideas are found in the Guru Granth Sahib. They've been embedded into the combined corpus of Sikh literature, Sikh scripture. And this attitude towards life has been positioned within the Sikh. So Farid is one of the Muslims whose writings are found in the Guru Granth Sahib. He lived around the 12 or 1300s, and he was a leader of a Sufi tariqa, like a Sufi order of students and masters, disciples, and teachers. The Qadri order, for those of you who know it. There is some discussion amongst historians. The Farid that we find in the Guru Granth Sahib, is that him I just mentioned here, or is it one of his students, like 10 generations down the line? Regardless of which Farid we are talking about, the views of this order is within the Guru Granth Sahib. And just read it yourself. Try to read it. So what you see here is that Farid is kind of lamenting the hardships of life. He basically wishes he was never born, because if he was not born, he would not have to suffer in this existence of life. I thought I was in trouble, but then when he looks out at the world, he sees everyone is in trouble. Everybody's suffering. Everybody has ups and downs in life. Life is basically like a roller coaster. There's like fire in each and every home. Now, one traditional way of understanding the Guru Granth Sahib is that it's more like a darbar. It's like you have a lot of ideas that are presented in the Guru Granth Sahib, but then the different poets and the different gurus and the authors, they will kind of discuss certain topics and ideas coming from different angles. And what you see here is that the fifth guru, he then addresses this worldview here, which is in the Guru Granth Sahib. He addresses it directly by speaking to Farid. This is not happening historically. So Farid lived at the time like 200 years probably before Guru Arjan. But then Guru Arjan, in a Metsa, as a form of Metsa communication, he addresses Farid this way. You see like how this works? And you have one idea, like the attitude towards life. Then you have one position where it's kind of negative, solemn, it's very serious. Then on the other hand, you have what becomes a C position. Later, we kind of understand this as Chardi Kala kind of approach towards life, where it says, in the midst of this beautiful earth, there's a garden of thorns. So life is not easy. There is a garden of thorns. You will get scratched from it. But those blessed beings, and those who are blessed by their spiritual teacher, they will not suffer from these scratches. So they will get scratched, but they will not suffer from it. Life is beautiful. Life is blessed and beautiful, And the body is beautiful as well. Only a few rare are found who love their beloved rules. And this is one of the major, like back then, this is one of, you could say to some extent, Sikh and Sufism were sister traditions, but this is one area where they really stand apart from one another. You can see it, we'll get back into the Persian writings as well, where we see this dichotomy really, really sharp. All right. In the Gurgansab as well, we see commentary again on the Quranic verses, or like Quranic concept, or like Islamic practices in the time. So you can see the very famous Quranic verse, O Prophet, tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their chastity. That is a pure way for them. This is the verse that precedes another verse, which is a famous verse where it tells women to wear the hijab, to cover their aura. So these two verses combined are very popular because this is what Muslim scholars later on will use to basically argue that women will have to wear the hijab, basically. Now, there's a commentary on this verse here in the Gurgansab. So basically, it's telling men to lower, just to explain. So later, Muslim scholars will say on a social level, like when people are meeting at schools and work and jobs in this, at the marketplace, at the bazaar, blah, 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 men can look at a woman and have the first glance at her, but he's not allowed to look a second time. So you see a lot of pious Muslims, even in the West, who will like try to avoid too much eye contact with the opposite gender. They're trying to, like in a pious way, try to manifest this teaching here. And that it's basically to avoid feeling attraction, feeling lust, feeling sensation of sorts. It's a way kind of to prevent that from happening. All right, in the Gurgansab, there's this commentary. Why should I keep my eyes lowered? Why should I look down? I see my beloved in each and every heart. So it's basically trying to elevate the social practice and saying, well, I see my beloved, I see Allah's nur in each and every heart. So I'm not feeling any lust towards the opposite gender. And you'll find a lot of similar concepts like this, where it's taking a social practice and just adding and infusing it with a more spiritual or esoteric kind of layer. Does that make sense? Yeah, so here you see again that the scriptures are kind of communicating with one another. I'm just going to run through quickly through each one here. But you also see commentary on external Islamic or Muslim practices of that time. Again, aiming to shift towards internalized states. So trying to lift social practice and like see it from a different perspective, try to elevate the way of thinking, try to think in a different manner. Kind of again, recentering the approach. So again, the adhan, the daily call to prayer. In the Muslim world, you'll hear it like 5 times a day. I'm not sure you have that here in the UK. It's banned in Denmark, so you can do the adhan there. Where in the Gurgansab you have this verse here. Says Kabir, O Mullah, why do you climb to the top of the minaret? The Lord is not deaf. And look within your own heart for the one for whose sake you shout your prayers. It's basically talking about an internalized, more personal relationship with Allah, rather than to force the whole village to come to the mosque to pray because now is the time. And again, trying to elevate, look within your own heart for the one for whose sake you shout your prayers. Circumcision, because there's another verse here from Kabir as well. Because of the love of women, circumcision is done. I don't believe in it, brothers. If God wished me to be a Muslim, it would be cut off by itself. If circumcision makes one a Muslim, then what about a woman? Again, I think this is kind of referring to like a popular discourse in Mughal India at the time, where like being Muslim was equated with also being circumcised. And here it kind of says, I don't believe in it, using these kind of arguments. Again, commenting on the practices at the time in regards to oppression of people and animals. Again, you have Kabir saying to use force is tyranny, even if you call it legal. Give up your holy books and remember the Lord, you fool. Stop oppressing others so badly. Kabir really like goes fast. And again, he's basically saying like you use your religious scriptures to use most of other people and animals. Again, give up your holy books. It's not doing anything good for you. It's not turning you into a better person. It's that we were talking about before. Approach your religion in a sweet manner. So give up your holy books and just focus on remembering God. And this is like something you see a lot with a lot of the saints in the Bhakti movement as well. Like give up the Vedas, give up the Quran, just focus on building an inner spirituality for yourself. Does that make sense? I could like do a whole lecture, whole presentation with so many different topics and stuff like. But we'll just continue into the literary scene now. This is the scripture. Point I was trying to make was just to show that it's embedded within the earliest Sikh canon, the Guru Granth Sahib. And again, finding with the verses of the Gurus, but also the verses of the Bhagats were there. You can do the same exercise or the same presentation in regard to Hinduism and Hindu practices, where you have the Bhagats and the Gurus also having this kind of dialogue with the Hindu tradition and the Hindu philosophy of the time. All right. For anyone doing research on the Sikh intellectual tradition, there's no way can do that without focusing on the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, who was born in 1661. Like I said, the 10th Guru of the Sikh tradition. The traditional accounts that have been preserved and passed down to us, they present the Guru as a warrior, as a poet, as a musician, as a political engineer, father, husband, and a leader. Some early poets refer to him as the Purushottam, the Purukottam, like the highest being, because he excels in all these different spheres. So he kind of becomes a role model, not entirely the same as how Muslims view the Prophet Muhammad, but it is that kind of role model, someone you want to emulate, someone you want to be like. This is like the status that Guru Gobind Singh manages to create within his own lifetime, and you don't really see that with the other gurus. So Guru Gobind Singh is very unique here. As a child, he was educated in accordance with the imperial standards of the day. He taught Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, Braj, Gurmukhi, Shastra Vidya, which is like martial arts, swordsmanship, musicology, weapon manufacturing. He comes to master the Purana, the Shastra, the Quran, classical Persian literature, and so forth. It's a very comprehensive education that is provided by his father and the courtiers in the northern city of Anandpur. And Guru Gobind Singh ends up becoming the main catalyst for the Sikh intellectual tradition. I'll explain why this in 2 seconds. So what happens is that Guru Gobind Singh, from an early age, he initiates a wide range of scholarly activities that spans about 25 years. And that's actually quite a long time. Just think back to what you were doing 25 years ago. That's like when 9/11 happened, right? So consistently, like just think back 25 years. That was a whole different world, so to speak. For consistently 25 years in a row, Guru Gobind Singh Ji is employing these scholarly activities in the town of Anandpur. He invites more than 100 scholars from across the Indo-Islamic world, from the Rajasthani courts, from the Mughal world in Lahore, Multan, Delhi, and so forth, to come to Anandpur, bringing with them their libraries, their vidya, their knowledge. He told them he would cover all their costs. You just come here to Anandpur and stay with me. He builds this darbar, this court, and then he also sends. So there's a traffic going into Anandpur where he stays, this is city, but there's also a traffic out of Anandpur. Because he sends Sikhs into the subcontinent to bring back any Sanskrit, Persian, or Braj book that contain valuable knowledge that the Sikhs could benefit from. So what you see here is basically an educational project that Guru Gobind Singh starts very early in his rule as a guru. And basically that's what my whole book is about. The literature they study, what it entails, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, if you find this topic interesting, I'll just skip through it quickly here. You can find it in the book. Yeah. All right. Ancient books, which are being mass transported to Anandpur over these 25 years. So they're translated. There's from Persian and from Sanskrit, maybe also from Arabic. They're studied, they're copied, and stored in this house of scholars where these 100 people live. Over time, this house comes to become a translation bureau, a library, a book depository, a learning institution, and an academy of scholars from all over the northern Mughal Empire. The only thing I wanted you to take away from this here is just that Guru Gobind Singh is building an institution. Yeah, it's not something sporadic, just did it like 1 or 2 weeks and then kind of went back to normal. This is very consistent, 25 years, a lot of resources, a lot of money is poured into this. And it is basically an educational program to uplift elements of his community, not all of them, but like elements of the community. Yeah. Long story short, wide vast scope of themes are studied here from the Persianate, Islamic, and Indic civilization. So history, mythology, geography, poetry, and literature manuals, political theory, just name dropping here, zoology, medicine, eroticism, philosophy, palmistry, mysticism, and so forth. One later British author, Leiden, I think, Leitner, in the colonial period, he says that for the Sikhs of this time, there were no social taboos. So they would study any knowledge that contained vidya. They would study any books that contained knowledge. So back then there was a lot of taboos, like the Brahmins would not study works written in Persian because it was considered as Malay Baka, like the language of the barbarians, and the other way around as well. Muslim scholars would not study Sanskrit because that was considered like the writing of Kafirs and so forth. Sikhs didn't really have that. They would just study anything that contained knowledge. So this is like why the British administrator Leitner, he mentions that Sikhs are a little bit unique here. They just study whatever is kind of there. Like even like stuff like this, eroticism, you have erotic literature, like quote unquote sex manuals. The Guru pays poets to translate and spread within the teachings within the community. Like today in Punjabi society, that's like unheard of. Like you don't even talk about that in an open setting. But you see Guru Gobind Singh actually paying people money to translate kind of literature for the benefit of the Sikhs. So again, social taboos were not really a thing, as you can see with all these writings here. All right, that is just conscious of time. That is just like the overall historical context that is presented for you. Now let's go more into the Islamic and the Sufi kind of aspects. This is a quote unquote eyewitness account from Guru Gobind Singh's translation and his commentary of the Bhagavad Gita. So Guru Gobind Singh does the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and he actually writes it in several places. These teachings that Krishna told Arjuna, these also apply to the Khalsa. He literally writes that in many places throughout the different chapters. He says, I have translated the Gita within Anandpur's thought. I have here seen the vernacular translations of these are the translation activities of the poets over there. I have here seen vernacular translation of all the Veda, the Purana, the Quran, the Middle Eastern scriptures, and all of them I see the essence of the one who permeates everything. The vernacular languages, Sanskrit, Arabic, all are to be considered as the voice of the one who permeates all. It's like a very basic understanding, like basic expression of Guru Gobind Singh's theology. You also find it in another writing called the al-Ustad, where Guru Gobind Singh praises the Lord, saying like the same. The one who's called Allah is also the one that Hindus call it. Another name, the mosque and the Dharamsala, the mosque and the temple is the same kind of, you all know this kind of verse. So again, there, the vernacular languages, Sanskrit, Arabic, all are to consider the voice of the one for me. So again, what I'm just focusing on here is that I have here seen vernacular translation of all the Vedas, Puranas, and the Quran, Middle Eastern scripture there. So this is a wider category here. Again, unfortunately, we don't know very much in regard to what these Islamic or Middle Eastern translations and objects of study were. At the very least, I'll talk about this a little bit in my book. At the very least, they likely included the Shahnameh, the Buddhistan, the Bustan, as well as the Bari Danish and the Mawiza Jahangir. And what is, I'm just name dropping some titles here, but what's interesting about these books and these writings is that these scriptures and literature informed in terms of moral ethics, social relations, and political science, the many different kingdoms, empires, and polities stretching from the Balkans in the west, part of the Ottoman Empire, to the Safavid Persia polity in the central region, to the Mughal Empire in the east. Does that make sense? So it's not like insignificant into the kind of writings that are just lying on a shelf and collecting a lot of dust. This is that stuff that ruling courts across the known world at the time is actually using, they're discussing it and so forth. The Sikhs are tapping into this kind of knowledge. With me, Java?
Mhm.
Great. That was just the introduction. We also know that there were several Persian literate scholars employed at Anandpur translated the literature or taught the language to others. A few of the names have been preserved, not all, but the ones that we do know of, by Nand Lal Goya, by Rai Singh, by Nand Chand, Pandit Kirpa Ram. There was a lot of Kashmiri Pandits who were working for Guru Gobind Singh, and a lot of them were Sanskrit literate. Kirpa Ram is one of them, but he's not the only one. A later source, this is from the colonial period. Again, Gyan Singh says, by having studied with these men, many Sikhs began, by spending time with these men, many Sikhs began to study Sanskrit and Persian. Again, there's an educational ideal here that the Guru wants his Sikhs to know Sanskrit, to know Persian, translate stuff, to discuss it amongst themselves, blah, blah, blah. This is a very beautiful manuscript located in London, in the Dr. Deepinder Singh collection, a very extensive collection of manuscripts, especially from the Anandpur court. And here it's a compilation of this Anandpuri Persian writings that we know of. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that have been lost, unfortunately. Now, what's interesting is that you see like Punjabi translations here in the red in the margin. So you can see that this manuscript has been used historically, like as a teaching aid in a circle of students and teachers. Yeah, so it's not like again just lying collecting dust in the shelf. Like it's being used in later decades or later centuries. So again, yeah, it has some kind of influence on later Sikh education. All right. Now, again, that was the historical context, the historical background. Let's look into Bhai Nand Lal Goya here. This is one of the main and most famous Persian literate and Arabic literate court poets that we know of. He's not the only one, but he's the one that has outshined all the others. So unfortunately, we don't know much about all the others. We know that he was born in Afghanistan and he was educated in the mosque of Afghanistan, and later again becomes one of the Guru Gobind Singh's court poets. He converts to Sikh quite late in life. I think he's about 40 or 50 when he becomes a Sikh. So his whole schooling, his whole grounding, his whole cultural formation is done outside of Sikh circles, not done in the Gurdwaras or the Dharamsalas and so forth. When he enters Anandpur, and he has become a Sikh at that time, he's already a grown-up man, basically. And he brings with him all this knowledge, all these skills of Arabic and Persian, and the insights into the classical traditions and literature and so forth. He's also from a very affluent family of what we call munshis. These are like administrative Mughal administrators. So he's from that kind of background. 13 works have been attributed to him, have survived, including the Divan Goya, Zindagi Nama, Faz, and so forth. I'll quote some of them in a little bit. There's also some writings that in Braj and Punjabi that has also been attributed to him. Some scholars say that he only wrote the Persian literature. He did not write Punjabi and the Braj. That's a different Nand Lal. So there's some discussion amongst the scholars on that. What's interesting about him, point I'm trying to make is that because he's already philosophically grounded, he's already educated, he's already schooled in Sufism, Vedanta, and all these different things. His understanding of Sikhi is basically through the sophisticated terminology of Sufism, because that's what he knows. Does that make sense? That's why his writings are so interesting. Now, what's interesting also about him is that his writings in Persian have been elevated and canonized in modern times. So Sikh institutions like the SGPC and others, they will say that if you want to understand Sikh philosophy, read the writings of Bhai Nand Lal, because he explains it like how to understand Sikh scripture. Yeah, that's a very unusual and a very elevated status to have. That is kind of like does that make sense?
Like even Kirtan as well.
Yeah, there are also some. Yeah, that's right. There's Kirtan as well. So he has a very elevated status. Let's say modern Sikh practice, and even some of his verses are recited every day by pious Sikhs across the world. Yeah. Right. What he does is that he does what we call a messa communication with the Qur'an, with Hadith, and central fingers like Hafiz, Shiraz, Yashoda, and others. And he thereby signals fluency in Islamic discourse, but also retaining critique of Sufism and Islamic tradition, standing on the Sikh platform, so to speak, like looking over to the Sufis. He positions and lets Sikhi participate in a trans-regional mystical conversation that has a shared symbolic vocabulary, references, and philosophical questions, but again, using the current language of power. This is like Persian back then was a Raj Pasha. It was an imperial language that was used Safavid Persia in the Mughal Empire and certain regions of the Ottoman Empire, I think, were also writing and communicating Persian. Yeah, so kind of same status English has today. Basically, it's used across the known world. It's a language that Vidya, the knowledge, science, and everything else was transmitted in. Does that make sense? And themes that Goya, the reason that his writings have been basically said, if you want to understand Sikh philosophy, then read the writings of Goya, is because he meditates and he discusses Persian terminology. Some of the key central Sikh concepts like Simran, like Kirtan, like Sangha, and so forth. So again, Simran here, meditation and chanting, Sangha, companionship of devotees traveling the path of love, admiration and love for the perfected spiritual guide, that's like Buddha Bhakti, and then Maryata here. Yeah. So again, because he discusses these concepts and notions throughout the Persian verses, Sikh institutions have said, if you want to understand what Sikh position is on these things, read his works. That he, meditates and dwells. Does that make sense? Cool. Now, again, it's not a surprise, but Goya's verses, they soothe a mystical inclination and reflection, but they also add an essential mystical flavor to Sikh literature of the time, because most of the literature at that time that was produced was about political science. Translation of the Shahnameh, the Hindu the Panchtantra, the Rajniti Rakab, I'm just name dropping a lot of stuff here, but this book is about political curriculum of Sikhs at the time, coming from the Sanskrit, the Persian world. So a lot of stuff happening in Anandpur at this time is about political science, but he kind of shows us that other activities were also happening in terms of love poetry and existential poetry and so forth. That's why he's kind of important, because he kind of is a window into that area, whereas a lot of the other stuff have been either outshone or we just lost it. Which is probably more likely we lost it over time. To this day, his works are exceptionally unique within the Sikh scholarly tradition because he wrote in a way that had not been seen before for 200 years, and it has not been replicated ever since. Yeah. So the way that he writes, the way he approaches Sikh using the Sufism as a lens to understand Sikh and discuss it and unpack it and whatever you call it. No one has actually done that ever since. So he's very unique in that sense. Or this thing that where I said Guru Granth Sahib kind of functions as a darbar. You have themes that are discussed and they have different angles of how to approach and see this kind of theme. Bhai Nand Lal does that same thing. This is a very old tradition that you find in Persian writings and literature of the time. What I'll show you now is so these translation of research has been done by Louis Fennick in the article that's about 20 years old now. And what they are discussing is what I've said earlier, is the outlook on life. So life, as we know it, is full of hardships and also full of joy. It's also full of ups and downs and so forth. And Divani, Hafiz Shirazi, who's a Persian, very famous classical poet and thinker and mystic in the Sufi tradition. Like if you have Iranian or Afghani friends, they will probably know a lot of his verses by heart. He's very famous. So I'll show you some verses from the Divani Hafiz, from the first ghazal that he has, and then I'll show you how Bhai Nand Lal answers that. And what you see here is basically meta communication between Sufism and Sikhism. Yeah. So this is the first verse, 101 in this ghazal collection. O cupbearer, quickly bring the vessel, fill it and pass it around the ring. Now here comes it. First, it appeared that love was easy, but afterwards problems arose. Again, like very quickly we jump to the problems. Like you have a rose in front of you, just focus on the thorn. Don't look at the rose, right? This is what happens here. First, it appeared love was easy, afterwards problems arose. Then you have Bhai Nand Lal kind of exhibiting this Chardikala kind of approach, like we saw with Guru Arjan earlier as well. O cupbearer, so he kind of using the same lingo here in the Persian. O cupbearer, give me the goblet of the life-giving goblet of wine, which gives color to hearts, so that with a clear-sighted eye, I may solve these problems. So hang on, like there's problems, but we'll solve them. Like, we're not going to sit in the corner and distance ourselves from the role or whatever. Like we're gonna bang on, we're gonna approach them and solve that. And you can kind of see like the point with this puzzle here, like this basic communication we're setting. So in the caravan of the beloved, what security of life is there for me? In Hafiz speaking. When every moment the bell dangling from the camel's neck calls out, bind your pack saddles, it's time to go. Basically means like every time you walk around outside, you're constantly reminded of death. Soon it's time to go. Look at nature, you see leaves are falling down from trees, animals are dying, beloveds are dying, and so forth. So bind your pack saddles, it's time to go. Then by Nand Lal, both in the caravan of the beloved, everything is everlasting joy and eternal delight for me. The bell dangling from the camel's neck laments in vain. Where shall we bind the pack saddles? Then the last verse kind of continues like that for 7 verses in total. The last word is like very reflective of it. O Hafiz, if you always desire his presence, do not be absent from him. When you find the person you love, abandon the world and its cares. This is again going back to these ascetic practices that I was telling you about earlier. So abandon, once you find the person you love, talking about the divine here, abandon the world and its cares. Then again, Bhai Nand Lal, since in every place I look, there's nothing but his pure essence. Oh, Goya, tell me why should I forsake this world and abandon it? Again, reflecting this very famous verse from Guru Gobind, like Sabagubin, like I see the divine light in everything, right? So why should I even forsake the world? It doesn't make any sense, right? So again, what we see here is a very beautiful meta communication between two leading masters of two spiritual traditions, represented by Hafiz Shirazi on the one hand, and then by Nand Lal Goya on the other, employing the language of Sufism, the Persian. Yes. If you find this interesting, please read the article of Louis Fenwick written in 1994. I copied it from the British Library like 15 years ago. It's on a PDF now. It's online. You can just Google it. It should come out. It's called Persian Sikh Scripture. So yeah, it's really, really good. And he goes into this like proper analysis of each verse and so forth. Yeah. All right, Bhai Nand Lal, like I said, also engaged with the wider corpus of Islamic literature and canon. So he comments on the Quran. Here's the Quranic verse, Surah 57, ayat number 3. He's the first and the last, the manifest of the unmanifested. He has full knowledge of all things. Then Bhai Nand Lal, he kind of takes that verse, uses the same terminology, and just applies it to the eternal Satguru, the eternal Guru. He's the first and the last sovereign. He's all seeing and thereby perceives both the hidden and the manifest. Now you can see it's the same kind of lingo. What Bhai Nand Lal does is very unique, like not unique, like it's very radical. Because he's actually changing the word order. So to make sure that this verse in the Quran, which is like rhythmic prose, he puts it into a different meter and makes it rhyme. Yeah. Now that was very normal for him, and then he also condenses it and makes it shorter. Now, it's very normal for Persian poets back in the day to take each other's verses and prove them and play with them and like kind of battle it out with each other. Hafiz wrote this, I think do it even better and say the same thing in a more concise and a shorter manner, blah, blah, blah. But you would never do that with the Quran. As the Muslims have, is Islam, they have this very old concept, I think it's called the Ijaz al-Quran, which is like the Quran is unmatchable. You cannot imitate the Quran. You cannot create anything better than it. It's like one of the proofs of God. It's like one of the miracles of God. So Persian poets, Arabic Persians, they would play around with each other's verses, but they would never try to rework the Quranic verses. This is very radical. Bhai Nand Lal then does that, as you can see here. Changes the wording order so that now it actually rhymes. Akhir and Zahid. Here you can see Akhir and then it's Zahid, so it doesn't rhyme. Now, what is Bhai Nand Lal trying to achieve with this? You can only speculate, but it was very radical for the time. Like you could easily probably get killed for trying to do this kind of thing. Another one where he shows mastery, like engages, is with the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. There's a very famous Hadith where Prophet Muhammad says, "I swear by the one whose hand is the soul of Muhammad, my nature will be split into 73, one of which will be in paradise, and 72 others will be in hell." Then Bhai Nand Lal says, without any doubt, we should consider this group, talking about the Sikhs, who's beyond the cycle of birth and death, to be the shelter of these groups who will go to hell. And then you can say, trying to bring them into the Sikh fold. Say it like that. Does that make sense? Yeah, I could do a lot of more. You kind of get the gist of it. Like you had here, like I said, you have he's engaging the thinkers, Hafiz Shirazi, he's engaging the Quran, and he's engaging the Hadith right here. You could do like probably a whole hour more of this. A lot of research has not really been done on this. So if any of you find this interesting, please jump and dive into it. It's really, really fascinating, but a lot of work needs to be done more on this. All right, I have 10 minutes left. Yeah, all right. So in Anandpur, just going back to the historical context, the Raj of Anandpur, where the over 100 poets or scholars were reciting, is sieged and destroyed by the Mughal and Pahari forces in 1704. This is a very significant year. The intellectual infrastructure there that Guru Gobind Singh created for 25 years is destroyed. Manuscripts are lost, scholars are killed, and they're dispersed. They go back to the Rajasthan, New Delhi course where they came from. So this whole project kind of demolished with the siege of Anandpur. In the following years, there's a shift from elite court culture, so Anandpur was elite court culture, to itinerant, decentralized intellectual life. Now, from here in the next many, many decades until the time of the missiles, it's now about portable knowledge. It's about social relations and flexible networks. So it's not about having a prime central institution anymore. You have an institution where people come and gather, they sit there, there's a guru who will pay money and patron you, and there's a central library. It's not about that anymore. Now it's dispersed, it's in the villages, in Dharamsala, and they're kind of doing it on a social level now. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And this thing here is the topic of my new book, basically. How does that look like? How does the Sikh world look like post Anandpur? All right. So the questions I ask, and the research questions I ask in my book is what kind of texts survive displacement? What formats of literature are favored when an institution collapses? Again, what are the writings that we have today? We only have them because someone decided they were worthy of being preserved, they were worthy of being copied into new manuscripts. So again, what formats are favored when institutions collapse? What can we actually say? What's the pattern? Because most of the knowledge or most of the literature has been lost. There's no doubt. And how does knowledge adapt to oral or note-based transmission? Yeah, these are the research questions I'm looking into in my book. All right. So what's surprising now? We'll get to the last part of my presentation now. This is post Anandpur. Guru Gobind Singh Ji, he passes away. There's no living guru, like in terms of human guru anymore for the Sikhs. The Sikhs are rebelling against the Khalsa Sikhs are rebelling against the Mughal Empire. They managed to create a kingdom in 1709 for a few years. And as a result of the Sikhs rebelling, the Mughals started to persecute Sikhs. It's a very like that image you saw in the beginning. That's like this is like why people think of the 1700s as being that. It's very bloody. A lot of genocides on the Sikhs are occurring. Now, surprisingly, it's not the students of Goya, yet students who championed Islamic learning afterwards and scholarship in the philosophical world of 18th century Sikhs. What we instead see is it's the Maluj students and the networks who gather around a person called Paikaneya, who many of you know not for scholarly activities, but you know him because of
Yeah, the
charity
Sakti,
work.
yeah.
So all of you probably seen this kind of image in the Gurdwaras, right? When you grew up. He was actually a very intellectual person. Somehow we just don't really talk about that. Yeah. So he created an order of people who did a lot of what you would today call charity work. They would go out, build wells, build schools, provide medicine, and take care of injured soldiers, both Muslims, Sikhs, and so forth. So like, even like Sikhs and Muslims were fighting each other, he would serve them all because they were injured, right? Yeah. So the students that gather around him, and who does a lot of charity work, they became known later on as the Sevapanthi, path of service. But they were doing Seva across not just Punjab, also in Sindh, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Sindh, in Maharashtra, they were there as well. So like they're basically outside Punjab in the Muslim majority territory. Now, interesting. I look into this in my book. They produced quite an extensive and rich body of mystical and commentarial literature that integrates both Islamic and Indic knowledge systems. So what I'll present here is primarily the Islamic stuff, but they've also done translations of the Yog Vashisht and a lot of Vedantic stuff as well. But I'll just do a narrow introduction here. All right, what we know from early sources, this is like from the 1730s. So this is like right after Banda Singh Bahadur has been martyred. When you have sources that start to comment on this person called Bhai Nand Lal, who just died a few years earlier, and he becomes the leader of a group of people. He comes from a wealthy background, actually. So even though we think of him as a very humble, very pious kind of person, he's actually from a very rich background. From a wealthy background of munshis. These were the Mughal administrators who had very extensive political connections across the Mughal world. And the munshis back then, they were Persian literate. They would write letters and communication and bureaucracy, all that stuff, right? So it's a very strong.
Like Bhai Nand Lal as well.
Bhai Nand Lal is also munshi, exactly. So due to his background, he was most likely proficient in Persian and fond of book learning. There's a, you can just read it for yourself. There's a uttering, there's a statement with some of his students, they wrote down his sermons. So we have access to some of the sermons that he was telling towards these students of his. And in one of them, he praises the concept of book learning. Let's just read this for yourself. The meaning is clear, right? So, yeah, he's basically saying, like, look beyond the physical feature. Some people just have a book and they just use it. I'm guilty of that as well. Sometimes I use the book to put my computer on top. And then there are other people who are much better, who actually who open the book, basically, and use it to prove themselves and do so. So again, just the fact that Bhai Nand Lal is having these kind of sermons to his students show that there's an educated element within his teachings and so forth. He passes away in 1708. He leaves behind a network of his students. The next one in line to take over this network is Bhai Sevapanthi in 1708. It's like 1718. This is 3 years after Banda Singh Bahadur has been martyred. Sikhs here are being persecuted. They're being hunted by the Mughal authorities. They want to teach them a lesson. Don't rebel again. Otherwise, you'll be sorry. He takes over the reign of this network of students. He carries their their charity work outside of Punjab into Jammu, Kashmir, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Sindh, and so forth. And then he passes away 10 years later. Then Adnan Shah takes over the reign. He's a very prominent leader within the Sevapanthi community. And they continue this trajectory of Islamic scholarship. Most of Sevaram's, that's in here, most of his excellent works today, you can see, focus on Sufi mysticism. So these include a range of geographies on Rabia, al-Basri, al-Hallaj, al-Mansur, and then these two who I'm not quite sure who are. But you have to see the historical context. The Sikhs are at war with Mughals. They're hunted, they're persecuted, they have severe defeats on the battlefield, they also have victory. And at the same time, you have Sikh scholars studying and reading and promoting the writing of Sufis. So again, you can see in the concept, it probably looked a bit weird, a bit odd, a bit out of context for reading what it is. Here's a quote from a later book from 1862 that says, well, obviously these are the leaders, right? By Adnan Shah in particular, by Sevaram, but they also had students underneath them. And this is one quote we can read here. Now, these networks here, they translate Rumi's Masnavi and then the alchemy of happiness. Like I said, these are the later elite kind of Sufi literature where Sufism has become systematized, and a lot of things that we associate with Sufism today because of the writing of these two master thinkers here. And now here's interesting. They provided katha of these, like they did in the Gurdwaras, the Dharamsalas, whatever they call it. They were having oral sermons about this Sufi Islamic literature. Right. Time is running up, so I'll just do it quickly. Rabia al-Basri, anyone of you heard about her? She's the one who brings the notion of love into Sufism, because she saw a community that had taken Islam as a kind of transactional religion. So if you do good, then Allah will reward you. So I can just, it's like mathematics. I do so and so many good deeds and I will get so and so many rewards. Yeah. And then if I abstain from doing sins, I will not be thrown in hell. So it's like it's not real. I'm not. Let me put it in another way. I'm not helping poor people because I feel a compassion for them. I'm helping poor people because I will go to paradise. It'll help me go to paradise. You see, it's more like a transaction, right? So she saw that and she was very disgusted by it. So she introduces the notion of love, and then it's a very famous story that you hear see in a Sikh version. Just read yourself. She's a very famous pioneer of Sufism, one of the early pioneers, and I think it kind of said itself. I will throw water into hell, obviously hell full of fire. She throw water into it, like she nullifies. There is no hell anymore. She threw water into it, and she will set fire to heaven, like burn it down to the ground, so that the only thing left is love. She has another verse, very beautiful, where she said, if I ever begin to worship Allah because of fear of hell, then throw me in hell. If I ever do it for the desire for paradise, then close the doors of paradise for me. Only let me worship you because of your beautiful face. I think. Yeah, you can see like a lot of this is also like very similar to Sikh teaching in Guru Gobind Singh. Similar verse from Kabir and from Guru Nanak as well. All right, this is the last slide, and then I'll stop. What these Sevapanthis do is that they create this. I'm not sure if they're the first one to do it, but like they really magnified this genre of literature called bhajan literature. Two books that are still extant, these ones that we have here, and they consist of 44 short stories and statements, similar to the Hadith, the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, but they don't carry any chain of transmission. They're part of a wider genre. Kind of uncertain if these were orally circulating statements or stories that were written down, so they were already present in society, or if they're translation from a Persian corpus. So Pyara Singh Padam, he says that these are translations of an Arabic book. I kind of think it's more like orally circulating stories that Sikhs hear, and then they kind of write them down. The sources from my research seems to be quite diverse and scattered. I've been able to trace some of them back to what we have to go into. It's called the Hadith al-Qudsi or the Nahj al-Balagha Imam Malik and so forth. So you can kind of see that there's a long tradition behind this going back to early literature. All right, in these two books, we're introduced to a vast array of the earliest pioneers of Sufism and their teachings. So this is in the earliest 3 centuries of Islamic history, so up until like the 1000s and 1100s. Again, which is very significant because these are not really that known. We often think of Sufism with Imam al-Ghazali or Rumi, Hafiz, and so forth. But here they decide to go into the early origins of Sufism, where a lot of these people were not even Sufis, they were ascetics, the ones that we were talking about briefly. Again, my central question is, why are these stories and teachings transmitted among Sikhs? Why are the gatha done of these? I'll show you the list in a bit. Why are the gatha of these early Sufis done in Sikh-centered learning, especially when the other Khalsa Sikhs at the time were fighting against the Muslims? Yeah, the stories that we hear I'm translating a lot of them, somewhat new geography for Sikhs. So these stories are not from India, from South Asia. They're from Baghdad, Bukhara, Kufa, Basra, Bastan, Val, Kerman, blah, blah, blah. Current day Iraq, Iran, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. So the Sikh listeners are also being introduced to a brand new geography here. Something interesting, you find interesting about Imam Ali, who's a very famous warrior of Islamic history. He's a leader in the Shia Islamic tradition. He's applauded as a saint. So the attributes or the sayings that are by him, he's never mentioned by name. All the other ones are mentioned by name. Imam Ali is just called the saint, which is a bit, I don't know, it's a bit intriguing. There's a few manuscripts where Bachchan is included, where he describes the commander of the faithful. It's called the Ali Sardar Taranwali, which is almost like a literal Punjabi translation of the Amir al-Mu'minin, which is like what they call him in Arabic, the leader of the faithful, commander of the faithful. All right, time's running out quickly. This is the list of the people in these two books I just mentioned before. As you can see, Rumi comes very late. He's almost like down here. So all of these are the early pioneers of Sufism, all the ascetics and so forth. This is what they're known for, like, yeah. Let's read yourself quickly. I just put in order of the here, so like Rumi down there is the last one. Yeah, all right. I don't know if we have time to read these. These one here, these are from Imam Ali. These are mentioned in it. So, but again, another saying the saints have said, again, why is it not mentioned? There's something I'm looking into. All right. There's a verse from Rumi. Again, just read it quickly. A lot of this is like ethical and moral teachings. Yeah. Again, translation of Rumi. So a lot of this is like basic, not basic, like these are oral stories, these are narratives, they're easy to remember, easy to transmit, but then you have the difficult stuff. This is the translation from Rumi's Masnad Imanavi and Imam Ghazali's Alchemy of Happiness. These are like the major literary outputs of this tradition. And they're, like I said, they're most likely the first translation in world history into non-Muslim vernacular. I'm doing some study at the moment of the Banos part, which is the Alchemy of Happiness, and it's very confusing to read because it's not a line-to-line translation. You have obviously the original text with me as well. So it's a very loose, liberal translation, and the translator is also putting in his own musings, philosophical thinking alongside the original text. So it's very confusing, but also very intriguing to study. Again, it's also written in pure Hindi, which is very odd considering it's a translation of Islamic book. So even like when we speak Punjabi, like modern Hindi, there's a lot of Persian loan words we use. This is completely Shuddh Hindi. It's very weird to kind of read because you're not used to seeing that kind of pure Hindi in such an early text. All right, you can just see this for yourself. This is from the Rumi. This is the most famous line from Rumi. I think we'll just skip this. Yeah, basically what I want you to take away from this presentation is that the literature and the focus that I've just presented illumines the interests and activities of the early modern Sikh literati, the Sikh scholars of the 1700s. Again, Sikhs can clearly see that Sikhs were not merely engaged in Guru history, they're not merely engaged in Gurbani teaching, but also engaged in a comprehensive study of prevalent ideas in the surrounding society, the Sanskrit, the Braj Pasha, and the Persian world. Yeah. So Sikh scholarship at this time is also to be outward oriented. All these different categories I showed you before. The Sevapanthis in particular appear to have focused their energies in Islam and the Islamic faith, while other networks, these are the minimalists in particular, within today, they seem to focus narrowly on the philosophies that come from the Indic and Sanskrit civilizations. You can kind of do a parallel presentation and just look at what the minimalists are doing and producing at the same time. Again, these exhibits of literati who are active participants in the intellectual, philosophical questions of the time they are living in. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. I wonder if it's a slightly earlier period, but I wonder if there's much of a criteria for the kind of Sufi text that would have made it into the sixth canon, would have made it into the Guru Gobind Singh. Like what was being considered and adjudicating the kind of Sufi text that would have made it in, with it just sort of famed because all the renowned gurus, or was it something like focus on the content of it, now what distinguishes from time necessity and another question.
Very good question. I'm not people. I'll just repeat it. I'm not sure if people are in the living room to hear it, but the criteria for inclusion of what we call the Bhagat Bani, like the same scholars from outside the tradition that were put into the Granth, what was the criteria for including them? There's different Sikh scholars have come up with different answers to that. So what you mentioned there is what they've come up with. Like one is like these were prevalent ideas that harmonize with the teaching of the Guru Granth Sahib. Others have said that it was used in order to sharpen and outline the Sikh positions more clearly. That's why you also have contradictions, so to speak, quote unquote. Which then you're creating a living debate within the Guru Granth Sahib itself. So I can't really, I'm not really sure what the answer is. There's different interpretations of that. Thank you.
I was just wondering about the caste question.
Yeah.
Because there was something you said about the Vedas, that there's a phrase of Vedas in the religion side. I think that the religion itself, like, or the limited understanding that I have, that it was also entire caste.
Yeah.
So where does that figure in?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like, so, I want to understand, so contemporary Sikh society, it's very casteist. We have separate gurdwaras for in Punjab.
And here, yeah.
We hear it as well. Like, for different castes, there are separate gurdwaras.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I don't know.
Not from Cambridge.
So I was just wondering, what are the mutations that you see? What was the thought about caste? And how do you see it now?
Well, I think I would say that Sikh philosophy is very anti-caste. So even that was actually another response that Sikh scholars have given of why the Bhagat Bani was put into the Guru Granth Sahib. A lot of them come from different castes, from the quote unquote lower caste of society. It's also to show them that they can be put on an equal par. Maybe you can say learn the teachings from people of the lower caste. So Sikhism is very you just do a whole presentation about it. There's a lot of both in the teachings and institutions and the practices where Sikhs are trying to combat the caste system. Unfortunately, the Indian caste system is very rigid, it's very strong, so it's very difficult to get rid of this for many, many other reasons. Like you said, you have Christians in India who've been Christians for thousands of years, they still follow the caste system. Even you have Muslims as well in Pakistan as well. It's just very much ingrained in the psyche, so it's very difficult to get rid of. But I would say on a philosophical level, Sikhism is very anti-caste. Then on a practical level, it's a bit more complicated.
And also, do you feel that the teachings, the way Sikhism, a lot of charity work, Khalsa Aid and all, so they, but that kind of emphasis, I don't see in terms of an anti-caste crusade in Punjab. Like Sikhi has been completely divorced from anti-caste teachings in its practice. And now I'm getting to know it's here as well, the same case.
Yeah. I'm probably not the right one to ask. I'm more into history about the 1700s, how things are working right now. I'm not really much of a capable of answering, but I mean, you're all right. There's a lot of messy stuff and a lot of discrimination happening until this day.
So there's something called religion in theory and religion in practice. So I was just trying to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You talked a little bit in the beginning about the exclusion of certain kind of ideas. And one thing that kind of popped up in my mind when you were talking about including sort of the different bhagats and sheikhs and all that stuff, we talked about sort of the contradictions. But what about kind of sort of stuff that was intentionally excluded? Do you see any themes in that? Well, first, I guess, is it preserved enough to?
I was just about to say, has it been preserved? Ashora Singh wrote a book about the Bhagats of Guru Gobind Singh, where he does much more of an in-depth analysis of also looking into the other writings that were not put into the Guru Gobind Singh. What can you say about those topics and themes? I think it's probably best to read Ashora Singh's book. I think that was the PhD actually.
Oh yeah, okay.
Anyone else?
I know you just said that you're mostly focused on the 1600s, 1700s rather than today, but it is related to what you've just said, which is that obviously a lot of your talk is focused on interreligious kind of dialogue, right? It's this dialogue that Sikhi is having with Sufism, right, in the kind of 1700s. Would you say today that as a kind of the Sikh community globally and as a bond that we've actually lost that interreligious dialogue completely? Really, that we have kind of become somewhat a bit more insular and that we kind of do focus on ourselves and not doing that kind of same that these Sikhs are actually doing at the time. Would you think that is the case?
Yeah, and that's also like one of the reasons I'm doing this kind of research, to actually show that Sikh scholars back then, they were looking out into the world and looking at the ideas that were prevalent in society, and then they were tapping into bringing Sikh ideas into the mainstream. Whereas, like you say today, which is primarily focused on reproducing existing knowledge of the Gurus and Gurus teachings. So, like, if you look at what a Gurdwara was teaching 50 years ago in London, and then look at what they're teaching today, it's kind of the same. Same stories, it's the same teaching. And
Same stuff here that we're all
same stuff
learning.
here, yeah, exactly. So there's not much evolution, there's not much like outward expansion. So yeah, that's also one of the reasons I'm writing, to actually show that Sikh literary used to be much more rich tradition, much more looking out into the world than actually preserving existing knowledge.
I just wanted to follow up on that because I appreciate again, it's not your sort of study, but I guess kind of after that sort of Balubara period into sort of the Sikh Raj, into even the Singh Sabha period, kind of were there still those threads of engagement with sort of different philosophies? Kind of where was that seen, especially with Islamic and Sufi philosophy?
I think it continues up until the early 1900s, actually. So even after the fall of Sikh Empire, you still see Sikh scholars engaging on. I think it was a very strong tradition among them. This is how we are scholars. Then again, it's not about blaming the British, but like this whole divide and conquer, rigid religiosity, who's a Hindu, who's a Muslim, who's a Sikh, that kind of takes over. And then Sikh scholars think, if you're a Sikh scholar, you need to study Sikh history, you need to teach Sikh teachings, and then it becomes very insular. But it happens gradually. I don't think it's something they were aware of what's happening, taking place. But now you see the result of
So the construction of religious boundaries kind of making be around.
Basically, yeah. So even like in the time of Mahatma Gandhi, like you see a lot of these Sevapanthi and Nirmalis, they're still continuing that tradition of like even like up until like 1911, I think the Nirmalis do another translation of the Quran. So like they're still looking out into the world and trying to rework their earlier writings and so forth. But I think around after 1920, it kind of drops. Yes.
So to say on that point, was it a patronage thing as well? In that I appreciate again, this might be a bit beyond, but like I'm assuming Ajit is saying probably, I don't know myself, probably did there was patronising at the time, they were willing to pay for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that we have also, I guess, kind of lost that element to a degree as well. Maybe 95 people can't do this full time anymore, whereas back then there was it's a practical sense.
There's definitely an element of patronage, and this thing that we don't have, Sikhs don't have institutions that provides these kind of services anymore. So like you might be lucky you have someone who will pay for you to do a certain kind of research, but it's not like there's institutional backing of it.
Yeah.
And then you might say, well, what he pays you is not enough because you have bills to pay, so you need to go find a real job instead.
Right.
Like they had institutions in place. So yeah, that the whole patronage kind of system is definitely part of it. I would say, look, like with social media, you do see kind of you have these groups across the world that are trying to revive this phenomenon. You have here in the UK, you have the Bunga, Azadi Bunga. In the UK, you have the Anandpur, sorry, in the US, you have the Anandpur Institute. They're kind of saying we have some Sikh values, some Sikh teachings that we can use to engage in a discussion with the rest of society with and bring our Sikh perspective into that conversation, like Bhai Nand Lal was doing with Sufism. So you kind of see that with social media, there is a trend that is happening gradually, slowly by slowly, which is fully divorced from the traditional Sikh Punjabi Gurdwara
Spaces.
Spaces, yes. So this is what social media creating these new platforms.
I just had a question about have you come across Sufi commentary on Sikhism, so the other way around? Because I guess they will also want to be differentiating. Is that an angle that you've looked at or worth pursuing?
I have not. I think there's a guy in India who's doing a PhD on this topic. He's looking at how Muslims in Punjab looked at Sikhs amongst them. I have a book at home. I live in Denmark. I have a book at home that's like this thick, and it's in Sindhi, and it's about Sikhism. So it's written in the Sindhi Arabic script, but I haven't read it. So I don't know, like if it's a translation of Rabbani or if it's like a commentary and they're trying to explain what Sikh teachings about. But it's written by a non-Sikh, Ghulam Ahmed, something like that. Yeah.
I'm interested in kind of like the literacy rates and the culture of learning within the Sikh society around like the kind of 1600s. So like what did that look like and how did that compare to kind of neighbouring kind of like Muslim communities?
It's a very good question. So what I presented before was like elite culture. So literacy was, I speak about this in the book as well, like literacy was not really that common back in the day, because back then most jobs did not require people to be able to read. Like today, you can't really find work, you need to be able to read contracts, blah, blah, blah. But back then, you could be a laborer, you could be a businessman without being able to read. It was possible. So most people who knew how to read on a popular level, they knew how to read like the basics of their religion, like how to recite verses from the Quran, how to read them. They knew how to read Qurbani, like the script. But apart from that, they couldn't really do much. Then you have an elite within that community who made up 2 or 3% of the whole community. And they are the ones who did all this extensive translational work and so forth. This is also, it's very good to mention, this is also why I emphasize what I said, it's like the difficult stuff with the translation of Rumi and Imam al-Ghazali, and then the more popular stuff with stories and narratives of the Sufi pioneers and so forth. Because this is something everybody, even the farmer or villager and agriculturist, they can still be part of the tradition. Something that was the more popular thing. But literacy back then globally was very limited, so we could select 2-3%, I would even argue.
And like what was the kind of response by, I guess, like common people towards the kind of like the kind of production response that we just talked about?
That's a good question.
As like were they like kind of like aware or responsible about it? Like probably not sort of a big extent.
I think there was what's the English word, like a trickle down effect. So even though they were sitting in these institutions in Anandpur court or later in Sam Maharan or these things or so, even though they were sitting there in these closed elitist circles and discussing these grand ideas which required obviously cognitive level of understanding, some, let's just say like, I'm just making up a random number, 10-15% of this also came out into the villages and through the stories, through the more simple, popular narratives. Especially in the time of Guru Gobind Singh, when the Sikhs came from the villages into Anandpur to sit and listen and talk with the poets, then they would sell them and teach them and so forth. So some of it were transmitted to the Sikhs in a more digestible manner, but not through direct study. Very good question, actually. Even like in my book here, I talked about for about 150 pages about all the grand stuff that the Sikhs back then are translating and studying and reworking, reproducing. And then in the 7th chapter, I opened up the chapter saying, how many Sikhs actually read this stuff? It's just like, you have to remember, this is elite stuff. It's not like the average farmer knew how to quote from Shahnameh and how to do, like, it is elite stuff. So it's a very good thing you were asked up.
Anyone's got any final questions?
You say there's like a shift in the types of engagement with Islamic philosophy from that kind of sort of elite era where, there's translations happening and kind of sort of these like rebuttals and stuff to more kind of simple sort of, hagiographical kind of like outlook, like, oh, life story, this, pass it down to the common man kind of thing. You say would that be like a kind of sort of shift argument that could be made, or are these stuff kind of happening in parallel?
I was going to say, I think they're happening in parallel. So you have the stuff that is that is transmitted at a popular level, and then in more close circles. I don't think it's happening like.
Because I'm thinking like, okay, this institution gets destroyed,
Yeah.
right? And I'm put at the bar, all this kind of knowledge is kind of lost, people are trying to recover it. And then now the kind of scholarship has shifted from sort of this high level intellectual engagement to, sort of like taking these buttons and stories and passing it.
Okay, so yeah, so that's what you're saying there is definitely true, but it's a more of a general thing, not necessarily with the Islamic stuff. It's more of general what happens after the destruction of the Anandpur court. It's a lot of manuscripts, especially the big like special translations of the Mahabharata, very bulky manuscripts,
Mm.
they're lost or it's too expensive to reproduce them constantly. So what happens is that they start to favor some of the more simple quote unquote literature, some of the encyclopedic writings like Janakya, which is like an encyclopedia of political science throughout 2,000 years, like put into very condensed verses. You have the Adhyatma Prakash, which kind of condenses Vedantic knowledge, not through like it condenses it basically.
Right. Yeah.
So to summarize it, so they start to favor these shorter ones because they're easier to produce. It's cheaper to produce these manuscripts, but also it's more simple to carry them on to new regions where Sikhs are residing. So yeah, in the Anandpur Darbar, where they have resources, there's a fixed core, there's a fixed library. It appears that they're also favoring big, bulky Qur'ans that are very heavy and very difficult and technical, difficult to understand. Then after destruction, they need to see what can we preserve, what is easy to carry around on horseback, what is easy to copy with when we don't have much ink to copy with. Then it becomes some of these smaller guns. And those are the ones that we see the Sampradaya working with today. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much of that is motivated from like preservation, like what is easy to preserve, and then also kind of, motivations like at this time, Guru Gobind Singh is Jyoti Jyot, right? Now there's kind of this sort of absence of a human guru. Maybe there's kind of like some kind of inclination to sort of have some kind of news stories, and then this kind of eventually morphs into like Sant culture. I don't know if that's too big of a step.
where I am now, I think it has more to do with practical needs,
Okay.
practical resources of a community who's lost their Raj.
Okay.
But I'll be happy to look into the other elements as well.
I think it might be interesting.
Because what you see is that in the manuscripts of the Mahabharata, for example, they seem to resurface in the Sikh community at the time of the missiles when they have the kingdoms, they have resources in the states.
Right.
But from what I know, I haven't been able to find any manuscripts of the Mahabharata from in that long period until then. But then start seeing them because now they have the resources to start doing these massive copies that are illuminated as well, like beautiful manuscripts, illustrations, and so forth. So money talks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's the end of the event. I just want to say thank you to Satnam Singh. We're just going to hear briefly from Dr. Butterwell just to give some closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up there. If that's it.
Can I just do a quick commercial? I've got 5 copies of my book. If anyone's interested in it, it's £25, and it is highly active. Thank you.
So I've been asked to share some concluding reflections, and I will not speak more than 5 minutes. So to begin with, thank you, Satnam, very much for this very rich and detailed narrative of some of the synergies across Sufi and Sikh borderlines, which, as you noted towards the beginning of your talk, which we forget nowadays because we tend to project back into the past certain developments that happened during the 9 years of the Mughal Empire. Now, of course, I won't try to summarize everything that was said, but just to step back from the detail of the discussion that you have given us today. So, as was pointed out towards the beginning of the talk, I'm based at the Faculty of Divinity, and where my job description is to study and teach the category called Hindu Studies. And generally speaking, I try to live up to my job description. Quite a lot of my research deals with the field of Vedanta philosophy, Vedanta theology. But I take the field of Hindu studies in a much more capacious sense to understand or to explore social religious interactions in South Asia from roughly the 10th century to 1946. So roughly we're talking about the last millennium. And I partly say 1946 because that's my way of sidestepping the question of the nation state. So what I'm interested in are some of these very detailed, complex transactions, negotiations, exchanges, and interactions without looking at them through the lens of the nation state. So for example, today we have been talking about some of the Muslim and Sikh interactions and exchanges. We may begin to ask questions like, are these Pakistani Muslims talking to Indian Sikhs? Right? And that question will not quite make sense in the time frame we're talking about in 1750, 1650, 1550. Now, a lot of my research is not so much on the western side, the northwestern side, but on the far eastern side. So the state of West Bengal in present-day India and Bangladesh is a large swathe of territory, and very similar processes can be found there as well. So I think you also have mentioned this point quite a few times in your talk, that a parallel discussion can be carried out with respect to some of these Hindu-Sikh interactions, in particular to the language of bhakti. And when you're talking about this spectrum, you can think of a triangular debate, a triangular discussion across the languages of Hindu bhakti, some of the Sikh idioms, and the languages of Sufism. Just to mention too, how the practice of the remembrance of the divine names, languages like Zikr, Dhikr, Sumiran, Simran, Smarana, and how the beautiful names are to be rehoused in the divine beloved, whom you can see becoming expressed in the human beloved. How the human beloved is an allegory for the divine beloved, and how the names are to be located not so much in the external world out there, but in the inner world of the heart. Now, that is an idea, if I were to ask, is this a Sufi idea? Is this a Hindu idea? Is it a Sikh idea? It is very difficult to say this is only an idea, A or B or C. Rather, what we find are some of this change of transmission between the, say, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And just to conclude with two very quick points, as I said, a lot of my research deals with the region that we call Bengal. One of the figures I work on quite a lot is the famous poet thinker Rabindranath Tagore. And as it turns out, his father, Rabindranath Tagore, was a great devotee of Hafiz. I mean, who would recite like couplets and the verses of Hafiz. And we read in the writings of the young Rabindranath that he grew up in this household that was deeply Indo-Islamic, deeply Indo-Persian. And some of these figures I study, they are also Munshids. So these are Munshids who have read huge amounts of Persian poetry, Sadi, Hafiz, and Rumi, of course, and they are transmitting some of this Indo-Persian language to the language of Bhakti. So if we were to have a triangular discussion, bringing in some of the Sikh ideas, Hindu Bhakti ideas, Hindu Vedantic ideas, and some of these ideas of Islamic Tasawwuf, I think we will have an even more interesting discussion that will run into at least 4 hours. So on that note, I will conclude.
If you want to buy a book, obviously, Satnam Singh is here as well. For those of you who signed up, we'll also be heading over to have food. We're going to be going to Byron Burgers, just a couple minutes on the main high street there as well. So thanks so much, guys, for coming.